Slasher movies, I love. Personally, I love horror movies, and the slasher genre is one of my favorite subgenres of horror. But even though I love them, I have to admit they are just not that good. I'd say 87% of slasher movies just suck. Even the most popular, well-known franchises in horror, in the slasher genre specifically, are mostly terrible. You look at Friday the 13th, which has 12 movies in its repertoire, and I think 2 are worth recommending or watching. And then you have Halloween, which is the pinnacle of the slasher genre, the one that kind of launched this subgenre into the atmosphere, if you will. When Halloween came out, John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978, it sent ripples throughout filmmaking. Everybody wanted a piece of the slasher subgenre pie and that sweet box office money. So you had crazy amounts of franchises coming out in the 80s, mid-80s, late 80s, and early 90s, to the point where the slasher reached this unstable high. And now, no one cares about the slasher anymore, because every single one is virtually the same, and every single one rips off Halloween in some way. And even Halloween, which reinvented the subgenre, just rips itself off at this point. But that's not to say that Halloween started this. Of course not. I mean, you had Psycho in 1960, you had Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 74. There's been slasher movies way before Halloween that were as popular, but Halloween did something to this genre that completely changed it. Fear Street is a slasher trilogy that is more or less just that. And that's not to say it's bad. I actually don't mind this trilogy. I think it's actually pretty solid for the most part, and there's even 1 out of the 3 that I legitimately really like. The other 2 we could talk about aren't my favorite, but the middle chapter of this is really fun. But let's not start with the middle chapter, of course. We need to start with where Fear Street starts off, at 1994. Fear Street 1994 is a interesting movie because there's a lot I like about it. But there's an equal amount that I really dislike about it.
Look, some guy killed a bunch of people at the mall last night.
Holy shit.
When I heard about Fear Street coming out, 1994 being the first one, it piqued my interest, to be honest. I looked at it and I said, that's an interesting idea to set this slasher movie and subsequent movies in at least 2 eras when the slasher was super popular. And I thought, you know what, that could be a really interesting, nostalgic, and pretty fun way to do a slasher movie. But unfortunately for 1994, it's really neither of those things. 1994 is unfortunately confused, meandering, and pretty obnoxious, if I'm being honest. It's not one that I particularly like, especially because it's just a really straightforward slasher movie. There's not a lot of twists and turns it takes that are particularly interesting. It's just a bunch of kids that are running from a supernatural threat that wants to murder them. It's a really straightforward movie with so little going for it that it's kind of hard to watch. In fact, it's my least favorite of the 3 by far. And that's not just because it's a really straightforward slasher movie with little going on, but because the main character is just incredibly obnoxious as well.
Oh, it's over.
Over?
Yeah. But thanks for your prompt reply.
It's not over. It's never over.
We ended it.
That's the biggest detriment to this movie. She is the most mopey and annoying character I've seen in a slasher movie, possibly ever. She is just a girl who got broken up with and is making it everybody's problem. And she's mean to everyone for no good reason. She's just not fun. She's not fun, she's not likable. Everybody that is around her seems to be annoyed by her to some degree. And then she does something really awful, and she's just not fun, okay? I don't like her. I find her incredibly obnoxious. She doesn't do anything likable. She doesn't redeem herself. She just does horrible things. And then it goes on to the next one. I don't like her. That burp was crazy. But it's not just that I have weird problems with. R.L. Stine, who wrote the books that this is based on, decided to name everything very on the nose, which would be fine for a YA adult novel. YA adult, young adult novel. A young adult novel, it would be fine to have really on the nose naming conventions, but for a hard R, violent, gory, film, it doesn't really work. I mean, you have Shadyside, which is the town our main characters live in, which is this rundown site where serial killers run loose, I guess. And then you have Sunnyside, which is a neighboring town where everything is perfect and idyllic and all the cool kids live there. But the naming conventions don't just stop there. The antagonist of this film, the witch, which we find out isn't really the antagonist, but we could talk about that later, is named Sarah Fear.
She makes the rules.
Who?
The witch.
But let's dive a little deeper into 1994. Even though I've been mostly negative up until this point, there are things I like about it. It's actually a pretty violent movie, and I enjoyed watching them throw blood around. That was pretty fun to see, especially because it boldly kills off some main characters, especially the ones that I liked, which I was a little upset about because they were the only characters I liked in this, but I was pleasantly surprised that they did. They just butcher people, and the kills are pretty creative and fun near the end. They're running around in this drugstore, I think, and the killer is using things in the department store to kill them, and that was a really entertaining little sequence. Strangely enough, though, 1994, even though it's set in the 90s, isn't all that 90s. I really wanted more out of the setting, more out of the era. I wanted it to kind of double down on that, but it doesn't really do that. I know there's a fine line to walk between over-exaggerating the era and setting that you are putting your movie into and underdoing it, but this movie kind of just underdoes it. It's a tightrope, I know, but there's just not that much that makes me feel like it's the 90s. I want to watch the skateboarding videos. I want to have terrible fashion. I want to see things like that. But it's like, oh, they're in a mall, and there's a couple things like toys and stuff from the era. Okay. It's not a negative, but it's not a positive. It's just like, okay, kind of wanted more out of that. But that is pretty much 1994. It's a pretty confused movie that has some things going for it, like some pretty fun kills and some okay characters, but it's really run down by the absolutely insufferable main character and a really predictable plot and structure. So let's move on to my favorite of this trilogy, Fear Street 1978.
Looks like blood.
Do you have a better idea?
Maybe.
Now, unlike 1994, which isn't really that 90s, I wanted more out of the 90s, my favorite part about 1978 is that it feels very 70s, late 70s. I very much appreciated that. They set this in a sleepaway camp, which was a great idea because those were huge in this era, and it's a big part of some slasher movies. I mean, there's literally a franchise called Sleepaway Camp that's about a killer in a sleepaway camp.
Well, I didn't know what to say to her, so I thanked her and I hung up. Then I got to thinking how this was all such a strange coincidence. So then I decided to call the Shit Sisters. You know something? You talk too much.
And this kind of feels like it's paying homage to that. It's really fun. I really enjoyed that. Doubling down on this setting was a great idea because you can have a killer running around in the middle of a capture the flag game, butchering kids. That's fun. I really love when a movie kills kids. Now don't click off the video. I'm not a psychopath. Maybe, but I really like when a movie doesn't hold back. And that's what this movie does, or doesn't do. It doesn't hold back. It kills these kids, and it shows it to some graphic detail. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the kills in this just like in 1994. I think they're a little less creative because it's just a guy with a axe murdering people. But it was really fun because they're in the middle of this sleepaway camp and you get to see activities from the sleepaway camp that probably would happen and the killer's running around in them. And I enjoyed that. And then the tone of this I liked a lot more than 1994 as well. That movie feels a lot more dour and serious, but this one kind of has this goofiness and camp.
What the hell?
That I liked. It doesn't take itself too seriously, so when it kills these kids and does some things that I don't care for, I can forgive it a lot more than I can in 1994 because it seems at least mildly self-aware. And that's a tough thing to do. The 1978 nails exactly what I think 1994 missed, is tone and the setting. The tone is really difficult, just like a setting. You don't want to overdo something, you don't want to underdo it, you don't want to be too serious with something like this, and you don't want to be too goofy. You gotta find a middle point between 1994 serious and Wet Hot American Summer goofy.
I couldn't possibly do it.
Oh, we just...
I said no!
But it's not all roses with this. I have a lot of issues with it that mainly come up in the third act. I don't like the third act of this. I think that actually starts to go into melodramatic territory. But not just that, there's like 2 or 3 twists at the end of this movie, and all of them are so predictable, it was painful, especially because it feels like the movie wanted you to not see them coming. It seems like the movie was going for shock, and it's not shocking at all. Like, the reveals happen and the camera like pushes in really hard, like they didn't know it was coming, but it was so predictable from the get-go, almost from the first time that it introduces that idea of a twist potentially happening. I was like, no, that's not it, no. I think even like a 13-year-old that was on their phone for half the movie could see that coming. It's pretty dumb. It's crazy what a likable main character can do for a movie as a whole. But that brings us to the final entry into this trilogy, 1666. Get it? Because 666 is scary? Ugh.
We can end the curse. For Shady Side. What the hell?
You see it now.
Sarah!
Unlike the other two, 1666 isn't really interested in being a slasher movie. It's really not even interested in being that much of a horror movie in the traditional sense. It's more scary in what it's trying to communicate. It's way more interested in telling a story, and I enjoyed that. I think what it's trying to say about passing judgment too quickly, stuff like that, mob mentality, is actually interesting, and I didn't expect it. So kudos to them for doing something different with this one, because the whole thing is set in 1666 in this small town where the witch panic is happening, and our main character of this, Sarah Fier, played by the main character from the 1999 or 4 one, because she's watching everything happen through Sarah Fier's eyes, so she's her, sort of. Everyone's blaming her for things, and she is being called a witch, and this girl that she has relations with is also called a witch, because being a lesbian back in the 1600s is evil, in the same era where people just got fevers and then died.
We have found the witch, may we burn her? Who do you know she is a witch? She looks like one.
But the message is the important part. This little town is infected by this fear
No way.
of witchcraft, of something they don't understand. And that's the ultimate arc of this trilogy, is just being accepting, really. Just accepting people for who they are. At least that's what I took out of it, and I enjoyed that message. But another surprise was that it turns into 1994 Part 2, which I knew was going to happen, obviously. It wasn't just going to be 1666 and then that ended and that's where the trilogy ends. No, they are definitely going to have to wrap up the main story from the 90s, but I didn't expect it to be almost half and half. I expected it to be like 1966, or why do I keep saying that? 1666 for 90 minutes of this 2-hour movie, and then the last 25 minutes is just a quick wrap-up, like they figured something out and then they kill the thing and then it's over. But no, they actually have an hour or so dedicated to the 1994 plot, and it kind of works. It's actually more interesting than the 1994 movie. They have this fun little plan that they're trying to do. There's a big twist, a big reveal that I actually didn't see coming, that I enjoyed quite a bit. The problem is, just like 1978, stumbles into this melodramatic territory in the third act, in the last probably 10 minutes or 15 minutes, that I didn't much care for. The tone, again, starts to kind of flip around on itself. The 1666 stuff is really serious, and rightfully so, and the 1994 stuff is also serious, but with this hint of camp to it that didn't really work for me. I think the tone is a little off in the latter part of this movie.
Up, down, down.
Up, up, down, down.
Left, right.
Left, right.
And there's this really confusing aspect to it where in the 1600s, everyone from the previous two movies is playing characters in the 1600s. Now, I can understand why our main character is seeing her family as a part of Sarah Fier's family because she's playing her, and then maybe even seeing this girl that she has relations with as the girl that she's having relations with as like a parallel between the two. I can understand that, but then there's people from the 1978 movie that are playing characters in the 1600s that our main character wouldn't know. So why are they there? It was just kind of confusing. It was a very weird choice. And then there's other characters that aren't a part of the other movies that are there as well. I don't know why you couldn't just do one or the other.
That's one.
So if you haven't seen them and you like slasher movies, I'd check it out. But if you haven't seen them and you don't like slasher movies, you're not missing anything. You shouldn't watch them. I wouldn't recommend them. This is for a very specific audience, like a really specific niche audience. And if you're not in that audience, it's not going to do much for you. So